No artificial intelligence, or any type of intelligence really, was used in the creation of this video. The name Bloody Mary refers to Queen Mary I of England, or Mary Tudor. She was the eldest daughter of King Henry VIII and an elder half-sister to Queen Elizabeth I. In this video, I hope to answer one simple question. What the hell was her deal? Mary was born to Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon in 1516, and her earliest years seemed healthy and stable. At that time, the Church of England was tied to the papacy in Rome, and England was a solidly Catholic nation. Her royal parents appeared happy, and she was receiving a strong yet pious education from her mother. Princesses, of course, were basically broodmares whose value was typically based on what sort of alliance could be created by marrying them off to some faraway prince. But young Mary wouldn't have known that, so just forget I even mentioned it. Here's where things begin to take a turn for Mary's trajectory. Both before and after Mary's birth, Queen Catherine's unpleasant womb was producing nothing but miscarriages and tears. Living at a time when other ancient noble families could make a powerful argument that they had a more legitimate claim to the throne than the Tudors meant that Henry had to have male heirs. This was a must. England had never had a true queen regnant, as in a queen who was a ruler in her own right, not merely a token ruler at her husband's side. There had always been a king at the helm. When Mary was only 9 years old, she was boxed up and shipped off to the borderlands near Wales. She was given a castle in her own court, and all seemed normal. However, this wasn't done to bestow some special honor on the little girl. The king was intentionally separating Mary from her mother with the intention of hurting Catherine. Meanwhile, Henry was trying to locate a future husband, for her, but every negotiation failed. Even Cardinal Wolsey was trying to pimp out the little girl, but none of the prospects were buying. Selling a daughter is rarely a simple task, especially when rumors are stirring that you intend to dispose of your wife, thus threatening said daughter's status. Such factors make it much more difficult for a princess to hold her value on the open market. You may have to consider a rent-to-own plan and hope that the lessee commits. Good luck with that. Prior to Catherine's joyful marriage with Henry, she was married to his older brother, Arthur. Gross, right? Arthur, then the Prince of Wales and heir apparent to the throne, died 6 months after they married. Catherine claimed that the marriage was never consummated. 6 months! Never consummated. I'm calling bullshit. I know I'm just po-folk, but if your marriage isn't consummated within 6 hours of your wedding, let alone 6 months, you should probably reconsider your options. I don't care if the reception dinner is running long. Find a closet or a vacant stall in the restroom and get at it. We have a kingdom to consider, sweetheart. Anyway, back to the lecture at hand. Henry, having already cropped out Catherine from all of the family photos, asked the Pope to annul his marriage based on her previous marriage to Arthur, and he quoted a few lines from the Bible stating something about it's generally a bad idea to marry your brother's wife. In modern times, unless you live with your extended family in a 1980s era mobile home, marrying one's brother's wife is not something one does. Back then, it wasn't viewed through the same lens of disgust, especially, as in Henry's case, if it was done to maintain an alliance. Getting to the point, the Pope said no, or likely something in Latin meaning no or go screw yourself. That seems like something a Pope would say. Since 1526, Henry had been pursuing a young hottie named Anne Boleyn, but don't worry about Anne Boleyn. I'm sure it was merely a simple fling and nothing will ever come of it. We'll never hear about her again, and she definitely will not give birth to Elizabeth I or get her head removed by an intensely sharp object only a few short years later. Go ahead and forget I even mentioned her name. Totally unimportant. Oh, so Henry wanted to marry that Anne chick who we already forgot about, but the Pope was being all disagreeable and shit. So, in 1531, an enraged King Henry moved Catherine of Aragon to various remote residences to distance her from court and her supporters. Their daughter Mary would have been 15 at the time and would never be allowed to see her mother again. Queen Catherine died 6 years later. Mary wasn't even permitted to attend her mother's funeral. At the same time, mechanisms were in play to sever the Church of England from the papacy. Henry and his advisors, many of whom still had their heads at that point, formulated a plan to appoint the king as the supreme head of the church, not the pope, and then the church, which he ruled over, could annul his marriage to Catherine. After that, he could marry that Anne Boleyn girl, who you already forgot about, I'm sure, and everyone could live happily ever after. The end. Okay, so not the end. Not enough people have had gruesome, horrible deaths yet. In 1533, with Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England, he married Anne Boleyn. I know, right? I'm shocked too. I thought she would have moved on by now. The people of England were not exactly jubilant over the break from Rome. They were even less happy with the dissolution of the monasteries, which was an official act that allowed King Henry's henchmen to take possession of the monasteries and other holy houses that had remained loyal to Rome. Their properties and wealth were consumed by the throne, and the monks, nuns, friars, and canons were told to drag their asses. Catholic uprisings did occur, but they were brought to an end through the patience and goodwill of the king, as well as excessive violence and bloodshed. Mary, ever the devout Catholic, was deeply unhappy and extremely critical of what she viewed as the desecration of her religion. The Church of England had now voided her mother's marriage to Henry, and she was no longer a princess. They had deemed her the child of an illegitimate marriage, making her a bastard. The Boleyn girl, or as some were calling her, the Queen, gave birth to baby Elizabeth, who I am dead certain will play no role of her own in England's future. I should point out that Anne was a reform-minded Catholic with heavy Protestant leanings. In young Mary's eyes, Anne may as well have been Jezebel reincarnated. That being said, Mary's household, much like the monasteries, was dissolved, and she was shipped off to serve her half-sister, infant Elizabeth, which I'm sure she didn't mind at all, being that Mary seemed like such a joyful, easy-going gal. Whoops, nope. It says here that she adamantly refused to acknowledge Anne as the queen, or little baby Elizabeth as a princess. It's a good thing she had such a patient and understanding father, who I'm certain wouldn't be offended by such a thing. Shit, wrong again. Henry was pissed off by this refusal, so he and Mary didn't speak for 3 years. Hold up. Good news for Mary. By 1536, Henry and Anne's marriage had run its course and was coming to its natural end. After all, it had been a whopping 3 years since they had wed. My, how time flies. After the birth of Elizabeth, Anne had several miscarriages and a stillborn son. Since her uterus was obviously not complying with the king's demands for a male heir, it was time to fabricate some charges of adultery and treason and remove her head from her non-baby-making body. With Anne Boleyn's pretty little head rolling around on the ground at the Tower of London, and young Elizabeth now stripped of her succession rights, Mary and her father kissed and made up. Even though Mary was pressured into signing a document attesting that her father was the true head of the Church of England and renouncing papal authority, her real feelings as a pious Catholic devoted to the Pope were not a well-kept secret. For years, she was pressured to renounce both her mother and her faith, but Mary refused. That refusal defined her life. Still deeming her as illegitimate, but with the urging of his new queen, Jane Seymour, Mary was welcomed back to court and granted a household. Typical Nepo baby nonsense. Jane gave birth to a boy, Edward, but she died only 12 days later. Sure, the queen is dead, but at least we have a male heir secured. We're 3 wives deep, and we finally have a boy to save the house of Tudor. Queens came and went, some without their heads, but Mary continued on. In 1543, Mary was 27 and still single. Her father married his 6th wife. Yes, 6th. The rest of us are out here struggling to get a date, and this guy is on his 6th wife, despite there being a 1/3 chance of getting her freshly separated head booted across the lawn of Hampton Court. Now older and somewhat more pleasant to be around, Henry VIII returned Mary and her sister Elizabeth to the line of succession. Of course, their little half-brother Eddie would come first, because he has a penis, and penises rule. Oof. That last line sounded awfully homosexual. Who wrote this thing? Oh, I did. Never mind. The king croaked in 1547, and the now 9-year-old Edward VI was King of England, Ireland, and a tiny portion of France. Edward reigned for a mere 6 years until his death in 1553, but during his tenure he made major reformations of the Church of England. It was no longer a Catholic church and had morphed into a purely Protestant body. Unlike his father, who had upheld Catholic doctrine despite severing the church from Rome, Edward was raised as a Protestant, and his Regency Council also leaned strongly Protestant. During Edward's reign, his council attempted to force Mary into compliance with the reformations, but failed. She openly refused to abandon Catholic Mass. When Edward fell ill, he made efforts to change the line of succession to bypass his sisters due to the fear of Mary undoing the religious reformations and returning England to Catholicism. Edward would have preferred the realm to pass over to a Protestant cousin, even a female cousin, such as Lady Jane Grey, than to have it fall into Mary's hands. When King Edward VI passed away in July of 1553 at 15 years old, his cousin once removed, 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey was, indeed, made Queen of England. A mere 13 days later, after Mary asserted her right to the throne, Lady Jane was deposed, and Mary became Queen Mary I of England, Ireland, and a tiny portion of France. She immediately had Lady Jane imprisoned in the Tower of London, and later beheaded for high treason. She did the same for a slew of others involved in the plot to deny Mary the throne. Yes, that's right. She had a 16-year-old girl beheaded despite recognizing that Lady Jane was merely a pawn in the scheme. Mary was now 37, still unwed and childless. Being more like her father than she may have wanted to admit, Mary knew she had to quickly find a mate and start breeding. The only way she would be able to keep her Protestant younger half-sister from getting to the throne one day would be to spit out some piglets of her own. So, it was time to find a man and get fornicating. The citizenry wished for their queen to marry an English noble. Mary, like many people who find themselves in power, could not have given two shits less what those people wanted. After much wrangling with Parliament and ignoring the advice of her Privy Council, Mary married Philip II of Spain, who was a widower and 10 years her junior. It was already obvious that Mary intended to return Catholicism to England, so marrying a Catholic prince, a Spanish one at that, made Protestants fear that the Spanish Inquisition could come to England. Their fears were justified. Despite having issued a proclamation that she would not compel her subjects to follow her faith, she began imprisoning leading Protestant clergy members. She began dismantling the religious reformations made by her brother and, indeed, restoring Catholicism. In 1554, Mary stopped menstruating and gained weight. She was symptomatically pregnant, but even her husband didn't truly believe that she was knocked up. Many months later, after failing to produce a child, or even a good fart, it was obvious that her eagerness to have a child caused a false pregnancy. By 1555, having worn the crown for not quite 2 years, Mary began targeting Protestants for breaking heresy laws, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom she forced to watch as his bishops were burned at the stake. During her 5-year reign, she would burn more than 280 alleged heretics at the stake, which is how she earned the moniker Bloody Mary. I think Barbecue Mary would have been more apropos, but what the hell do I know? In 1557, Mary decided that she was pregnant again, which, as queen, was her queenly prerogative. Philip was rarely with her, spending much of their marriage in other countries, so wishful thinking was the only thing that was going to put a bun in that aging oven. Come spring of the following year, no child was born, and her false pregnancy was likely a symptom of her impending illness. Queen Mary I passed away later that year, at the age of 42, potentially of uterine cancer, or ovarian cysts, or perhaps just shitty karma. Her husband Philip was in Brussels at the time, despite the fact that his wife had been severely ill and increasingly weak for many months prior. After Mary's death, the daughter of headless Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth, became Queen of England and Ireland, but not a tiny portion of France, because Mary lost that bit of France during her reign. Loser. So what the hell was Mary's deal? Her mother was cruelly removed from her, and, for the most petty reasons, she was never allowed to see her again. She was declared a bastard for the same reasons. For many years her future was wholly uncertain. Even her brother, on his deathbed, attempted to deny her the crown. They even attempted to remove her faith. But that doesn't mean she is deserving of sympathy for her time as queen. When it came time to rule England, Mary, who had experienced so much pain and had witnessed firsthand what happens to a nation under a sovereign who cared more about his own desires than the suffering of his people, had a choice. She could use the lessons of her 37 years and rule with dignity and compassion, or she could be a vengeful, pious bitch. She chose option B. Yes, her early life was painful due to her father's selfish decisions. Her later years, however, were painful due to her own.